Hi, Algebra 2. This is Mrs. Langford. I'm going to continue with the notes over Concept 41, solving rational equations. So we were ready for example C. And we're using the method, let me just check and make sure. Yep. We're using the method where we are finding a least common denominator between all of our expressions and then using that as a multiplier to clear the denominator. So if I look at C, I notice that I have x plus 1 and 2x as my denominators. So my least common denominator will be both of those terms. So I'm going to multiply, and I just show I'm multiplying the entire equation by putting it in a parentheses. And now I'm going to show just how I'm distributing. So I'm taking my 2x times x plus 1 times that first rational expression, 3x over x plus 1. The x plus 1's divide out, and I'm left with 3x times 2x. Now with my second expression, and I just have minus, my 2x's divide out, and so I have 5 times x plus 1. And then my equal sign, and then my third expression, the 2x's divide out, and I'm left with 3 times x plus 1. So now it's just cleanup work. So we have 6x squared minus 5x minus 5, we have to distribute that negative, equals 3x plus 3. So we have a quadratic to solve, so you're going to move everything over, in this case to the left side of the equal sign. Now I notice that I can divide everything by 2, and that's going to make my solve a little easier. I'm going to see if this will factor, and if it is, it's a level 2. So I do have numbers that will multiply to give me a times c, which is negative 12, will combine to give me negative 4, and that's negative 6 and 2. So now I have to do the factor by grouping. So I split up the middle term using negative 6x plus 2x. And then I factor out a greatest common factor of 3x, and then a positive 2. My common factor is x plus 2, and then what's left is 3x plus 2. So now I can set each of those factors equal to 0, and these are my two potential answers. I just look and make sure that neither of these numbers will give me a 0 in the denominator. You can also put them on your calculator and see if the left side equals the right side, and they do for both of those numbers, so those are both solutions. Sometimes in our next example, we have to do, or it's good to do a little factoring in the denominators before we get a common denominator. So if you notice in our second denominator, that can factor as 12 over x plus 1 times x minus 1. So now our common denominator will be just that, x plus 1 times x minus 1. I'm going to put a parentheses around my entire equation, and I'm multiplying by x plus 1 times x minus 1. I'm not sure why I didn't do that to the expression underneath. That would have been better, but it's going to work the same. So my x plus 1's will divide out, and I'm left with 4x plus 1 times x minus 1 and an equal sign. Both of my denominators will divide out, and so I'll be left with just 12. And then 3 times x plus 1 times x minus 1. Now the cleanup is just a little tricky here. So on the left side, you need to FOIL those two expressions, 4x plus 1 times x minus 1, which will give you 4x squared minus 3x minus 1. And then on the right, you need to multiply the x plus 1 times x minus 1, or I would first. And then you're going to distribute the 3. So we're just going to rewrite the left side and then take 3x times x squared and then times minus 1. Now move everything over to the left side. I like that side because it'll give me a positive x squared term. So you'll get x squared minus 3x and then minus 10 when it's all the numbers are over to the left side. This will factor for you. So negative 5 and 2 will multiply to give you negative 10 and to give you negative 3. It's a level 1 factoring, so we get to go right to our two sets of parentheses, and then our potential answers are 5 and negative 2. I go all the way up and just make sure that neither of these will give me 0 in my denominator, and they will not. I can also check them on my calculator, make sure that the left side equals the right side, which it does. We just work a lot of these because you know, there's, just so you can get an idea of the variety of the types of common denominators and solving that can happen during these. So again, we have a little factoring to do on problem A. And then these problems, we're going to end up with some extraneous solutions. That means solutions that look like they work, but when we plug them back in, they do not. So now I can see that my common denominator will be x plus 3 times x minus 3. So I'm going to multiply everything by x plus 3 times x minus 3 over 1. So when I distribute that to my first expression, my x minus 3 divides out, so I get 6 times x plus 3. And then when I multiply by my second rational, both divide out, and I'm just left with 8x squared minus, and then with my third rational expression, the x plus 3's divide out, so I'm left with 4x times x minus 3. Now we just need to clean up, so let's distribute, and then distribute here, and let's get, we're going to have a quadratic, so everything on one side, I'm going to keep it on the right side, so that it's positive. My x squared is positive. So 4x squared. Oh goodness, I have a sign wrong. So that should be minus 6x, and yes, I should have subtracted my 6x over. All right, so let's do that. And then I can divide everything by 2. So I'll be left with 2x squared minus 3x minus 9. Excuse me. Now let's see if we can factor two numbers that'll multiply to give us negative 18 and combine to give us negative 3. So negative 6 and 3. And now I can factor by grouping. So I can factor out a 2x and a positive 3. And I'm left with x minus 3 times 2x plus 3. And now I'm going to continue that equaling 0. So my two potential answers are positive 3 and negative 3 halves. So I look, and my positive 3, so let me just rewrite this so you can, is not going to work for me, because if I plug it in, I will get a 0 in the denominator. And positive negative 3 halves, though, will work for me. All right, now I'm just going to move through. It's going to look a little messy for a minute. There we go. Whoa, okay. Now let's look at this one. And let me just do a little bit of cleanup. So I factor my denominator here. And then I see my common denominator will be x minus 2 times x plus 2. I'm going to group that entire equation and multiply it by my common denominator over 1. So when I distribute it to my first rational term, my x minus 2's divide out, I get 9 times x plus 2. Then my second one, the x plus 2's will divide out, and I get 6x times x minus 2. And then finally, both of my terms divide out in the denominator, and I am just left with 9x squared. So now I'm going to distribute and just solve that equation. So I'm going to get my x squareds on, everything on one side of the equation. So I'm moving it to the right. So that gives me 3x squared, and then negative 3x, but I'm going to add it over and subtract my 18. I notice I can divide everything by 3, so I do. I get x squared plus x minus 6, And then the two numbers that I'll multiply to give me that and add, or -6 and add to give me 1 is +3 and 2. And then my potential answers are -3 and 2. But if I plug in 2 into the original, I get 0 in the denominator. So my only answer is -3. So here you can see we have these extraneous solutions that we need to check. All right. So on this one, I'm going to factor that first denominator as x plus 1 times x minus 1. And then my common denominator will be that, x plus 1 times x minus 1. Hopefully, or the order doesn't matter there. And then hopefully you're getting this process. So take the entire equation by that common denominator over 1. So in the first term, the x minus 1s will divide out, and you're left with 7 times x plus 1 minus 5 times both of those terms, x plus 1, x minus 1, equaling 6. And then both the x plus 1 and x minus 1 divide out. All right, now we get to just have a big cleanup fest where we distribute. First thing, I'm going to multiply x plus 1 times x minus 1. And now I'm going to distribute my 5. So I get -5x squared plus 5 equals 6. Moving everything over, well, I'm going to the right side, but I'm writing it on the left. So I get, no, I'm sorry, moving it to the right side. 5x squared minus 7x. And then 7 plus 5 is 12. Subtract it over, I get a -6. So I'm looking for two expressions that I'll multiply to give me 5x squared, so 5x and x, and then numbers that I'll multiply to give me -6. So it factors as 5x plus 3 times x minus 2. Now I just factored that using guess and check in my head, but you can do the level 2 factoring, factor by grouping. Both of those numbers will not give us a 0 in the denominator, so those are both solutions. All right, so you can paint a room in 8 hours. Working together, you and your friend can paint the room in just 5 hours. So let T be the time in hours that your friend would take to paint the room when your friend's working alone. Copy and complete the table. So if you don't have a table set up in problems like these, setting up a table is always good. It helps you keep the information organized. And then we're going to use a simple formula that rate times time equals, in this case, the work done. So the work rate times the amount of time will equal the amount of work done. So your work rate is 1 room in 8 hours, and you are painting with your friend and you get it done in 5 hours, okay? So the amount of work done for you is 5 times 1 over 8, or 5/8. Now your friend, you don't know the amount of time that they can take to paint a room on their own. So we have to write that rate as 1 over t. That's what we're looking for. And then the time spent painting together is 5. So for your friend, the amount of work done is 5 times 1 over t. So the work that you get done, 5/8, plus the work that your friend gets done, 5 over some fractional amount, is equal to 1 room painted. So we use that idea to set up an equation. So B says explain what the sum of the expressions represented in the last column. Well, we just talked about that, and now we're going to write and solve an equation. So the amount of work that you get done plus the amount of work your friend equals 1 job done. So using that method to solve, our common denominator is 8t, and you multiply that by each term. So our 8's divide out, we get 5 times t. Our t's divide out, we get 5 times h, which is 40, and then 1 times 8t is 8t. So 40 equals 3t, and then t equals 13 1/3. So your friend takes a little bit longer than you do to paint a room, 13 1/3 hours. But together, you can do it in 5 hours because your rate is 1 room in 8 hours. So that is how long it would take your friend to paint the room when working alone. Now, if you have printed out our note sheet, you will see that there is one more example, but we are going to, I believe, skip that one. So we have now finished with the Concept 41 Solving Rational Function Notes Part 2.